My mom sent a message that cut cleaner than any knife: "We no longer trust you." I stared at the screen long enough to feel something inside me go quiet. Then I typed back the only word I had left in me: understood. 2 days later, their lawyer called me in a panic, his voice shaking as if he already knew what I had stopped pretending not to see. And that was the moment I realized something terrifying: losing their trust didn't hurt nearly as much as realizing they never trusted me at all. My name is Oren, and before I tell you what really happened to my family and what they tried to take from me, I'd love to know you're here with me. Before I share my story, I want to know you're listening. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. If you want to follow this journey to the end, every truth, every twist, every moment they tried to silence, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. Not for the numbers, but because it reminds me that someone out there cares enough to stay. I'm Oren Vale, and this is where everything begins. I read the message at 8:14 a.m. like a line from someone else's life. "We no longer trust you." I sat on the edge of my couch in my small Portland apartment with a mug that had gone lukewarm rain, making the streetlights smear into watercolor out the window, and for a second, the room felt like a photograph. Flat color drained everything staged. I answered without anger, without pleading, because I had been practicing silence for years. I answered because I had nothing left to bargain with. Understood. Saying it felt like closing a drawer. It felt like admitting what I had suspected for a long time, that my value to them had never been my voice or my company, but the ledger in my bank. I started that ledger 5 years earlier when the mortgage on the family house in Spokane slipped out of reach. I became the automatic transfer, $1.850 every month, like rent paid to a ghost, plus whatever the roof needed after the last storm, the property insurance, the internet, so the kids could do homework. I set the transfers to run on payday, and I never thought to ask for a thank you, at least not at first. I told myself I was keeping a home intact. I told myself that the math would one day translate into more than obligation, that some thank you or recognition would arrive in the margins. It didn't. My mother, Evelyn, curated a public life on Facebook where she framed Sierra, my sister, as the family's future. Sierra posted smiling photos in front of that house like it was her accomplishment. At family dinners, their compliments landed on Sierra's shoulders. The thanks never fell my way. When the message came, I didn't explode. I opened the banking app, fingers steady, and canceled the automatic mortgage transfer. It was cleaner than yelling. It was quieter than a fight. It was a boundary written in code and numbers. As soon as I hit confirm, an email popped into my inbox from the bank. A request had been submitted last week to change the primary contact on the mortgage to a Miss Sierra Vale. They were moving pieces while pretending I still sat at the table. They were trying to change the locks without telling me. They were trying to rewrite ownership in a language I hadn't been allowed to read. They are changing everything without telling me. I pulled up my online statements and leaned in until the rain above the street seemed to slow. Every line item swam into focus. There it was, a $2 $400 transfer to a Visa emergency card. I recognized Sierra's card, the same card I had covered before, when she'd been between jobs, the same card that had become a permanent fixture of her life rather than a temporary fix. When you see a number on your screen that you recognize from bailouts you've given time, and again, the anger isn't loud at first. It's a cold calculation that unfurls into memory: last winter's tuition, the dented brakes, the daycare gaps I paid through. I texted Sierra, "Have you used my card again?" No reply. I called Mom. She answered with that practiced softness and said, "She's going through a lot. She'll pay you back." Let's not make this into a thing. Let's not make this into a thing. Words that mean in their mouth, never mind the truth. I scrolled through my social feed and found the post that landed like a sucker punch: my mother's photo of the family on the porch with a banner of caption "Pride, Home Sweet Home," and praise for Sierra, nothing about the years of payments that had kept that roof over their heads. The comments were an echo chamber of emojis and validation. Neighbors and cousins clapped in public for the woman my dollars had kept there. The group chat, God, was worse. Someone had posted a meme of a man handing over his wallet with the caption "Big Brother Energy Pay, now ask never," and within minutes I'd been tagged 3 times. Jokes piled on jokes until my face in the thread meant nothing more than a punchline. I left the chat. They added me back. I left again and blocked them all. Blocking didn't protect me, it only made them louder elsewhere. I called the bank because I needed to know what else I didn't know. The customer service rep read something off and then almost casually said there'd been a request submitted to change the primary contact on the mortgage last week and it was pending verification. My stomach dropped in a way that made my hands go cold. I scrolled through an old email thread and found a form my father had apparently signed that listed me as a co-signer on a loan they'd taken out without telling me. The word betrayal is cheap until you can point to the documents that carry it. I started recording everything. My phone was set to save audio automatically when I was near the house in Spokane for reasons I would have called paranoia a week before. That day, mowing the backyard I had tended for years, I heard them. Their voices traveled through the open kitchen window, too clear, too ordinary to be a performance. Sierra laughed about how Aunt Karen believed the house was hers. Mom giggled that once the paperwork was done, I would be powerless because I'd insisted on keeping the mortgage in my name. Then the line I had feared and needed to hear to make all of this real. He's not family anymore. He's just a sponsor. The phrase landed like a verdict. I stood still with the hose in my hand, water dripping as if the motion would anchor me to the ground. When I slid the phone out, the recorder had captured every syllable. I folded my hands around the device and felt something settle inside me that wasn't rage so much as resolve. I drove back to Portland with the recorder buzzing against my thigh, printed my statements, stamped dates, highlighted transfers, and started building a ledger that could not be dismissed as memory. They changed the locks. I will change how I respond. I turned my apartment into an evidence room, a place where memory and math met under the hum of a desk lamp. I printed 211 pages of transactions, every transfer from my account to the Spokane mortgage highlighted in yellow dates, circled merchant names, annotated with short notes, roof repair emergency, HVAC property tax insurance. I labeled folders by year, by vendor, by the excuses I had learned to absorb: daycare gap, broken transmission, unexpected tuition. I saved the audio file from the mower that had caught my mother and Sierra laughing about me. I exported screenshots of the group chat, cropped out the memes, enlarged the timestamps until the pixels looked like fingerprints. I pulled the scanned documents the bank had emailed me and compared them to earlier paperwork I kept in a fireproof box. The signature on the transfer form looked off pressure and slant, not matching the clean loop of my true signature. The file properties on the PDF suggested it had been edited after submission. I felt the strange combination of a calm investigator and a man on the verge of losing himself to obsession. I called a lawyer I trusted and asked in guarded sentences about the rights of a person who had been quietly funding a property for years. He warned me about internal transfers and the ways a family could use trusts and corporate entities to shield actions. He told me to document everything and to be prepared for denials. While we spoke, I dug deeper into the loan file and found a routing number attached to one of the wire payments I didn't recognize, a small lending company in Idaho that surfaced in a few flagged transactions. Whoever was moving money had collateral beyond our kitchen table arguments. The presence of a third party meant this was no longer only family drama. It had become a financial network operating behind closed doors. I thought of Grandpa Henry, the man who used to keep a leather-bound ledger and who once handled the family trust. His handwriting lived in the margins of old estate documents I'd seen as a kid. I called him. His voice on the phone was quieter than I expected, brittle with years and something like shame. He told me he'd been under the weather but agreed haltingly to look into the old trust papers if I brought him copies. That small concession felt like a sliver of light. As I examined the scanned transfer forms again at midnight, I noticed more anomalies. Dates altered, a faint duplicate of my signature layered in a way that suggested a cut and paste rather than a true stroke. Whoever had done this had access to scans and time. It had been planned. I folded the 211-page packet, carefully put a copy on a branded USB, and wrote a public invoice in case I had to make things undeniable in front of people who preferred the theater of appearances. I planned the birthday in Seattle with 2 routes: reveal everything in front of the guests or file in court and let the legal system do its unromantic work. Then the anonymous email arrived with 1 cold line and a photograph of a portion of my ledger attached. "We know what you're doing. Be careful. The image was cropped to show one highlighted line and nothing else, as if whoever sent it wanted me to know they'd seen me look back. My skin prickled. Someone had noticed the motion of my head as I had been unpeeling their life. They had started watching me, and they did not like that I was awake. The backlash began like static, at first a trickle of messages, and then a torrent designed to destabilize. My phone became a theater of escalating scripts. My mother's texts moved from brittle to theatrical accusations wrapped in wounded tone, pleas disguised as logic. Sierra's came in sharp clips of defensiveness, and my father's voicemail landed like an indictment. If you want a war, you'll get one. I listened to that voicemail 3 times and saved it. The calls multiplied. An aunt who had never called me about anything important asked if I was sure I wanted to make family business public. Their message was consistent across voices: you are the one causing harm. I started tracing the scripts and noticed they weren't spontaneous conversations had been coached, narratives planted. Someone had rehearsed the lines for them. Digging back into the Idaho lender's trail, I discovered emails between Sierra and a Spokane agent arranging next steps for a transfer dates penciled in, and a closing coordinator copied without my name anywhere on the chain. A formal email from my mother landed in my inbox with the kind of phrasing that had been vetted by counsel for the safety of family finances. You are no longer authorized to manage any documents or transactions related to shared property. I replied in 3 words: I acknowledge. Then the bank called to tell me there had been a complaint filed claiming I had interfered with the account, and that their fraud team would open an inquiry. The accusation inverted the situation. I was no longer the man who had paid the bills. I had become the intruder. As I cross-checked every contract I had on file, I found the same irregularity in another place. A repair invoice from a company I'd never contracted showed my name, and what looked like my signature on its authorization page, but the stroke weight was wrong, the pressure inconsistent. I exported high-resolution images and overlaid them with my genuine signatures until the differences were undeniable to me. At the same time, a cousin called with a rehearsed line about unity and sacrifice. She spoke with the same rhythm as the voicemail my father left. It became clear someone had orchestrated a chorus to drown out my proof. I drove to Idaho on a promise from Grandpa Henry to meet with him and bring him the folders. He received me in a room full of old papers, maps, and a small safe. He turned pages slowly and without surprise. He said he had suspected but lacked the documents until now. He handed me a photocopy of a request to amend the trust that bore a signature eerily like mine and a date that matched the window when the lender began moving funds. He had never signed that amendment, he said, and neither had I. He agreed to look into the legal trail and to contact an old acquaintance who knew trusts and titles. When I left his care that evening, I felt the weight shift slightly, not because the danger had diminished, but because an unseen anchor had been found. Back at my apartment, I rehearsed what I would say at the birthday calm, precise documentary. I would not shout. I would not plead. I would show the receipts, the recordings, the forged scans, and the chain of emails that implicated a broker, a lender, and the coordinates of the plan. If they wanted to cast me as a villain, they would have to explain the physical evidence on the table. I laid out the USB, the printed invoice, and a copy of Grandpa Henry's note on the kitchen counter like tools, as if I were preparing for surgery. My phone buzzed with another anonymous message: you should stop. I turned the notification off and told myself that fear was a language they used to keep people quiet. If they intended to make me out to be the perpetrator, I would become the one who could not be lied about, the man who knew all the numbers and where they led. I tried speaking to them directly, thinking that maybe if they heard my voice instead of seeing my silence, they would pull back from whatever narrative they were building. I called my mother first, but the line didn't even ring. She had blocked me. I tried my father next. His voice was flat, stripped of anything familiar, and he said only, "Everything will be handled without your interference." Then he hung up. That single word, interference, made it clear that they were no longer positioning me as part of the household, but as someone trying to force his way in. Later that afternoon, a number from Spokane texted me. It was a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years. She wrote that she felt compelled to tell me something that my mother had been telling people: Sierra was the one keeping the mortgage afloat and that I had never contributed. The message hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just that they had erased me. It was that they had rewritten the entire story in public. I opened the audio file from the day in the yard and listened again. This time, beneath the laughter and the mocking tone, I heard a sentence I had missed before. Once the paperwork goes through, we'll have grounds to cut him out of everything. They weren't only scheming emotionally, they were building a legal excuse to erase me on paper. That realization hollowed out the room. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, not sure whether to feel sick or vindicated for having trusted my instincts. That night, an email arrived confirming a short-term loan application tied to an old secondary email account I'd once created for Sierra to use temporarily. She had used it again, but now the loan was in my name, my credit, my liability. If it went unpaid, the debt collectors would come to me. I opened my laptop wide on the floor and spread blank sheets around me, drawing timelines, arrows, financial flows, connecting each incident. The forged signatures, the mortgage transfer request, the Idaho lender's appearance, the group chat mockery, the mysterious repair contract, and now this loan. My living room floor became a map of everything I had ignored for too long. As I connected these lines with ink that bled a little at the edges, a single pattern emerged. Everything converged on one date, the night of my mother's 60th birthday celebration in Seattle. I received another message from Grandpa Henry later that evening. His words were brief, but carried a gravity different from the rehearsed guilt my parents liked to wield. When you come to Seattle, bring everything. Trust no one. The sentence stopped me. It suggested he knew more than he had admitted over the phone. It suggested he had been watching the edges of this fall apart long before I noticed the cracks. The next morning, an email invitation arrived for the birthday gala, my name typed neatly, my personal email listed. Even in the middle of this escalating conflict, they wanted me there. It wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. They assumed I wouldn't dare disrupt a room full of family and friends. They were counting on my silence, the same silence that had bankrolled them for years. I stared at the glowing subject line and felt something sharpen in me. I folded the timelines, the screenshots, the recordings, the forged pages, and slid them into a single binder. As I closed it, I told myself quietly, if there is one place where the truth belongs, it's where they expect me to say nothing at all. The call came while I was driving to the store, my Bluetooth lighting up with an unknown number. The man introduced himself as an attorney representing my parents. His tone was cool, professional, the kind that implies your name has already been discussed in rooms you weren't invited into. He said my actions were creating significant legal risk for my parents, and that the simplest way to resolve everything was for me to sign a voluntary relinquishment of all claims and associations related to the Spokane house. When I refused, his voice thinned. If you continue down this path, your family will have no choice but to file suit. I hung up before he finished and pulled into a parking lot, staring at the steering wheel as if it held the next move. Later that day, an envelope arrived with a repair invoice from a company I had never heard of. It listed me as the authorizing signature for thousands of dollars in work. The signature was wrong, the same digital mimic I had seen on the loan document. They were building a mountain of paper to bury me under. I gathered the envelope, took photos of every page, and added it to the binder. I drove to Idaho to meet Grandpa Henry, hoping for clarity. He was waiting in a modest room with neatly stacked folders and a small safe at his feet. He looked older than I remembered, but sharper too, as if the years had given him more precision than time could dull. He examined the paperwork I brought, flipping, slowly pausing at certain lines. He told me he had once transferred partial trust authority to my parents with the expectation that they would manage it ethically. Instead, they had siphoned and rearranged funds, stretching the trust in ways it was never intended. He admitted he had suspected they had been leaning on me financially for far too long, but he had lacked hard proof. Now, with the forged documents and the transfer requests, he had enough to reassert control. When he reached the request to alter the trust, a request supposedly bearing my signature and Sierra's, he stopped completely. He traced the stroke of the signature with a shaking finger and said, "This was never signed by you, nor by me." That confirmation didn't feel like validation. It felt like mourning. A line had been crossed long before I ever saw the evidence. I returned to Portland and spent the evening preparing what I would say in Seattle. I typed and deleted, trying to find the balance between calm and unmistakable truth. I rehearsed the opening lines aloud, imagining the room, the lights, the expressions on their faces when the documents appeared. I printed a clean copy of the ledger 200 pages and set aside multiple USB drives with labeled folders. I wasn't just preparing an argument, I was preparing a defense for my own existence. As I packed my phone, buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. "We need to meet before you arrive in Seattle." I hesitated but followed the instructions to a coffee shop near the interstate. The man who approached introduced himself as the Spokane broker I had seen referenced in the emails. He looked uneasy, glancing around before sitting. He admitted Sierra owed him money, that she had used my name as leverage to secure services she couldn't afford, and that he had begun to worry when the lender from Idaho got involved. He slid a printed chain of emails across the table messages where Sierra openly acknowledged using my information. I tucked them into the binder without saying much. That night, another document found its way to me, this time from a relative I barely knew. She sent a PDF of a speech drafted for my mother's birthday celebration. In it, I was painted as ungrateful, distant, irresponsible, a man who had abandoned his family rather than supported it. They were preparing to humiliate me publicly. They wanted a room full of witnesses to validate their rewriting of my place in their story. When I finally made it to my hotel in Seattle, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself the way you look at someone you've just learned the truth about. My voice barely rose above a whisper when I said, "They've prepared everything to erase me. I'll prepare everything to tell the truth." Then I turned off the light, knowing the next day would decide everything. The night of my mother's 60th birthday felt unnaturally warm for Seattle. As I walked into the event hall, the air shifted around me in a way that made every movement feel too sharp. The chandeliers glowed in gold tones that should have felt celebratory, but instead pressed down with a kind of staged heaviness. Conversations overlapped like a hum meant to distract from the tension that pulsed underneath. When people turned to look at me, their expressions held a blend of curiosity, discomfort, and something close to expectation. I realized, standing there with my binder under my arm, that I no longer feared any of them. That fear had burned off somewhere on the highway between Portland and Seattle. What remained was clarity. Across the room, my mother, my father, and Sierra moved through the clusters of guests with the synchronicity of people hosting a show they had rehearsed. Their smiles were precise, their gestures measured, but their eyes flicked toward me with something brittle behind the gloss. They weren't avoiding me because of anger. They were avoiding me because they were scared of what I might do, of what I might reveal, of the quiet I had maintained for so long that now held a different weight. I felt their dread before I heard it. The event opened exactly the way I expected, a slideshow of family photos curated to erase any complication. Sierra's childhood pictures, Sierra's graduation, Sierra's kids in matching sweaters on the porch of the Spokane house. My name never appeared. When the video faded, Sierra stepped forward to speak, praising our mother's strength, praising the family's unity, weaving remarks that landed like little needles in my direction about those who distance themselves and those who forget where they came from. Several guests turned toward me slowly as if my reaction were part of the entertainment. I didn't wait for the applause. I walked to the stage, my steps echoing against the marble floor. No one invited me, but the room stilled as if everyone had known this was coming. I took the microphone, opened my binder, and plugged the USB into the projector. My father started to rise, but I had already clicked play. The recording washed through the room, my mother's voice, Sierra's laughter, the words sponsor and not family bouncing off the walls. Gasps punctured the silence. I switched the screen to the screenshots, the group chat threads mocking me, their comments, the memes, the signatures that had been fabricated, the mortgage history, the lender documents from Idaho, the email chains between Sierra and the broker, the speech prepared to discredit me. Each slide landed with a weight no one could intercept. I read the totals aloud. $380,000. Years of bills, repairs, taxes, utilities, everything. Then I said clearly, "If this house is not mine, then this amount is a debt owed to me. There is no version of this story where I am both excluded and responsible." My mother burst into tears, my father shouted that I was lying, and Sierra tried to claim the audio was manipulated. But the evidence drowned their voices before they even fully rose. The guests didn't lean toward them. They leaned away. The truth wasn't convenient, but it was undeniable. Then the doors opened behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Grandpa Henry walked slowly down the aisle carrying a folder tucked under his arm. He reached the stage, took the mic from me, and spoke with a steadiness that made even my father fall silent. He announced that he had reviewed the documents I had given him along with the trust amendments, and he had filed the necessary paperwork earlier that day to remove my parents and Sierra from all trust authority and any inheritance rights. His final statement broke whatever composure the room had left. Anyone who profits off another person's labor without acknowledgement has forfeited the right to call it legacy. Chaos followed. Some relatives approached me quietly, apologizing for not knowing. Others slipped out or avoided my gaze completely. My parents shouted questions they didn't want answered. I stepped off the stage without looking at any of them. As I walked toward the exit, the noise behind me blurred into something distant. I told myself with a calm I had never felt around them, I didn't come here for revenge. I came here for an ending. I woke in the hotel the next morning to my phone vibrating endlessly. Voicemails stacked on top of each other, messages from my mother accusing me of destroying the family, my father insisting I had humiliated them, Sierra writing that I had betrayed them publicly. I didn't respond. I saved everything. Silence had been used against me once. Now it was mine to control. By noon, I started hearing from relatives who had witnessed my family's attempts to rewrite the narrative online. Posts had gone up painting me as unstable, troubled, angry. A cousin forwarded screenshots showing my mother claiming I had fabricated documents to hurt them. Another relative texted warning me that my parents had begun telling neighbors a story in which I had shown up uninvited and created a scene. None of it mattered anymore. Their performance had lost its audience. That afternoon, the attorney who had threatened me before called again, but this time his voice carried urgency rather than arrogance. He said they wanted a quiet resolution. He asked what amount I would accept to settle. I said I don't want a negotiation. I want the full amount I paid. I gave him 72 hours. If they didn't return every dollar, I would file the case and distribute the evidence publicly. He tried to warn me about consequences, but he knew the documents I held were catastrophic for them. Exactly 72 hours later, a transfer appeared in my account. $380,000. But the sender wasn't my parents. It was a small business account from Idaho, likely the same lender or someone my father had turned to out of desperation. Seeing that transfer told me everything about how cornered they truly were. They hadn't repaid me because they wanted to make amends. They did it because they had been forced to. I drafted a final email to my parents. The funds have been received. All obligations between us are concluded. Then I severed every financial link, closed, shared accounts, revoked access, changed passwords, shut down anything that tied me to them in ways they could exploit. I returned to Portland and moved into a new apartment with wide windows and quiet hallways. No buzzing group chats, no late-night pleas, no subtle manipulations disguised as family concern. Mornings became unfamiliar in their peace. Walking into a day without someone needing something from me felt strange at first, like stepping into a room where the furniture had been rearranged. But slowly, the strangeness became relief. A letter arrived from Grandpa Henry a week later. The envelope was handwritten, the script slightly unsteady but firm. Inside he wrote, "You deserve a life that belongs to you." What happened in Seattle was not a breaking, it was a revealing. You are free from their weight now. I held the letter for a long moment, letting the words settle in the space where obligation used to live. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks. It wasn't joy that filled me, but a quiet sense of alignment. I understood finally that what I had been chasing all those years wasn't their approval, it was clarity. Standing up for myself didn't make me feel lighter. It made me feel real. On a calm morning, a few days later, I stood by the window of my new place, sunlight drifting across the floorboards, my phone silent for the first time in years. I thought of the house in Spokane, of every dollar, every repair, every message I had once sent hoping to be seen. And I whispered to myself, I'm not who they needed me to be. I'm just the last one to leave a home that stopped being mine long ago. And with that, I stepped forward into the life that waited for me, one they could no longer take. In the quiet that followed, I learned something I wish I had understood years earlier. Freedom is rarely loud. It doesn't come with applause or vindication or a moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It arrives in small, steady breaths. In mornings, where the only sound is your own heartbeat. In evenings where no one is demanding your attention or your wallet or your silence. And in the stillness, I began to recognize the person I had buried beneath obligation for most of my life. I realized how long I had been negotiating my worth with people who had already decided the price they were willing to pay for me. I had mistaken proximity for affection and duty for belonging. Stepping away from them was not the collapse of a family. It was the collapse of an illusion I had held onto for far too long. There were days when I wondered if I had been too harsh or too final or too unforgiving. But every time that doubt surfaced, I revisited the evidence, not the paperwork itself, but the emotional record beneath it, the years of being used, dismissed, erased. The reality that I had poured myself into saving a home that had no room for me. The acknowledgement that love without respect is only another form of debt. And once I understood that, the doubt quieted. I didn't lose a family. I stopped financing one. Now when I walk through my new apartment, when I make coffee in the morning without waiting for a message that tells me what crisis I must fix next, when I sit with the calm certainty that my life is my own, I feel something close to gratitude. Not for what happened, but for the clarity it forced me to gain. Pain is a brutal teacher, but sometimes it is the only one we listen to. And in its wake, I learned that boundaries aren't walls built to keep love out. They're doors that finally open inward. If you've followed my story this far, if you've listened to the parts that were hardest to say aloud, then I want to thank you. People often talk about healing as if it requires forgiveness or reconciliation or some grand moment of closure. But sometimes healing is simply being heard. Knowing that your experience didn't disappear into the void. Knowing that your truth landed somewhere. So before I leave you with the final line of this chapter in my life, I'd like to ask something simple. If you're here with me, if any part of this story echoed something in your own life, let me know you're listening. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever had to walk away from a place you once called home. Sometimes connection is the only thread that keeps us from feeling like we went through the worst parts of our life alone. And if you want to stay with me as I keep telling the truth, as I share more of what it means to break cycles that were handed to us before we even knew how to speak, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the channel. Not for the numbers, not for the algorithm, but because every person who stays reminds me that what I survived matters, that what I'm rebuilding matters, that maybe someone else out there needs to hear that you're allowed to walk away even when the world tells you family is forever. This is where my old life ends and where I begin again. And if you're still here with me, then thank you for listening, for staying, for witnessing the truth I spent years carrying alone. My name is Oren Vale, and this is not the end of my story. It's just the first time I'm finally telling it as myself. And as I move forward step by step into a life shaped by choice rather than expectation, I hope my story reminds you of something simple but easily forgotten. You are allowed to choose yourself, even when it hurts, even when others don't understand, even when you have to walk away to finally feel whole. If my voice reaches you, let it be a reminder that starting over is not failure. It's freedom.